Lately, I've been dealing with a pretty small but pretty annoying issue called phantom wipe, and it's exactly what it sounds like. On occasion, the ghost that haunts my house likes to help wipe the windshield wipers come on by themselves, so I gotta fix that. But the ghost part is very real. In the last episode of the Fiero series, I tackled a lot of finishing touches for certain sections of the car. I rebuilt some seatbelt buckles, cleaned up all of the hardware for the door panels, and even fabricated some components from scratch for mounting them properly, bolted up all of the body panels for the rear of the car, rebuilt the taillights with some decent looking lenses free of cracks now, and fully rebuilt the luggage rack. I said at the end of that video that finishing this car up is not as simple as replacing the cracked glass and throwing on the rest of the panels. And that's because there's a bunch of little issues that are still plaguing the car. Things I've mentioned in previous videos but never got around to doing anything about. So, welcome to the episode where I do something about them. Phantom wipe is on the list, but there are a few more things that take precedence over what ultimately is just a minor inconvenience. During the test drive I took you guys along for back in part 8, I mentioned a big ol' clunky clunk sound every now and then, and that it was due to the exhaust hitting the subframe. Wowee, I guess this is what you get for using aluminized and plated steel components. But the issue I'm dealing with is this upright bend here. There is about 2 millimeters of clearance. That's not enough when barely touching it causes it to collide with the frame. Luckily, there's a joint right here in the exhaust, and I'm hoping that sliding it out just a little bit will be enough so that there's no clearance issues. That's an idea that might work if you're actually able to get this to move, but man, oh man, I was not. Oh boy. Okay, new strategy. Aside from where the head tube bolts up to the exhaust manifold, the only things holding up the exhaust in place are a bunch of little springs. The new plan is to lose a couple of them. I loosened the clamp where the head tube meets the manifold, temporarily popped off the forwardmost springs, and then permanently removed the rearmost spring from both of the groups at the muffler. I'm trying to fucking cut this piece of shit. Oh yeah! Since they're the ones applying the force that's pulling the exhaust forward, it should now want to sit a little more rearward naturally, and that should allow the bend to clear the subframe. Probably even better than my original plan. I bolted the tube back up where it meets the manifold, and also installed the springs back there. Look at all that clearance! Oh yeah! I can fit my whole fingers underneath here, which is a lot more than 2 millimeters. I checked. The only bad thing now is that with this pushed back, the outlet tube of the exhaust is now colliding with the heat shield on the trunk. Oh my goodness! If you remember, I had to modify this exhaust kit a lot in order to get it to even fit remotely, and it's looking like it's going to need a bit more of that here. With it out, we can see the issue. The pipe is pretty much supposed to be in line with the major axis of the ellipse that is the muffler, but it's way too far off. Where's that exhaust music at? A little bit of high heat paint to prevent this boy from rusting, and that finishes up this job. Oh yeah, that is a lot more in line. My welding still isn't stellar, but it's enough. I definitely did a lot better here than I did modifying the exhaust for my brother's twin turbo. Wait, I haven't released the videos for that series yet. Anyways. No clunks. So much more tolerance now. I fit my whole hand behind there. My fingers, at least. Nice! No clunking, and there's loads of clearance in both areas now. But oh my god, that's a lot of surface rust on the trunk I somehow missed. I should probably fix that. Cool. There were a few of you that pointed out in the comments on some older videos that the tip moves around way too much. And it absolutely does. That's because it's missing a little hanger that the factory one had. My new exhaust unfortunately doesn't have this as one piece and instead has a slip fitting and subsequently a clamp right where the bracket would normally go. I'm sure I could do some welding wizardry and make something, but this is apparently a common enough issue where you can just buy a fix for it. Rodney Dickman, the same guy who sells the rebuild kit for the headlight motors I used all the way back in part 4 of this series, also sells a stainless steel exhaust clamp that doubles as the hanger for this exact problem. Looking at this now, I'm pretty sure I could have done a DIY version, but having it in stainless steel is super nice. Not to mention that buying this also supports people that support the Fiero community, so that's cool too. Oh yeah. Holy crap, that's extremely stiff now. Oh yeah, that's good. But one more thing that's going to help prevent the exhaust from moving around so much is preventing the engine from moving around so much. The engine mounts for this car are all brand new except for the one up top. It's commonly referred to as the dog bone, but I think the technical name for it is the engine torque arm. Regardless, it's bad. The rubber is completely rotted. I have this new one right here though. With that good and tight, I can finally reinstall this little cover plate that I took off over a year ago. But alright, that wraps up the exhaust work. No more wild shaking. And because I was in the neighborhood, I should probably take care of some other little things back here. Firstly, I finally reinstalled the cruise control throttle cable. Everything else for cruise control was installed a long time ago, but not the actual thing that directly operates the engine, which is kind of important. But cool, that should finally work now. The other little thing here is the original oil fill cap on the valve cover wasn't sealing well enough, as I thought you could see here, but holy crap, remind me not to ever rely on auto exposure ever again. I popped a shiny brand new one on, and that should stop the slow leak here. Now the next task, unfortunately, is not as simple as twisting on a cap, and that is taking out the f***ing gas tank again. As you guys know, the fuel level sender stopped working. As you can see here, when I ground out the signal wire for it, it goes to empty, and when it's unplugged entirely, it pegs it full. And that tells us that all of the wiring and electronics for the gauge back to the connector are working exactly as they should. And because it pegs at full when the connector to the tank is plugged in, that means there's some discontinuity in the circuit inside the tank. At first glance, everything looks perfectly fine. I half expected to see a wire loose or even the DIY bracket I soldered on snapped off or something like that, but it all looks okay. What I don't like is how wobbly this is. It should just be a pivot, where the only movement is the rotation on this axis. It should not have that much play or slop in the system. The excessive play was worrisome at first, but after looking at the side, it's still making complete contact all throughout the motion. I did a lot of prodding and probing with the multimeter until I finally figured out what the problem is. When probing the start of the potentiometer and ground, we should see a resistance value anywhere between 0 and 90 ohms but it's showing an incomplete circuit. I moved from the ground bolts to the actual solder joint at the start of the ground wire, but still nothing. Only when I touch the actual metal of the pivot arm do I see an actual value, and one that's reading exactly as it should. It looks like we got ourselves a cold solder joint, boys. And that is not my fault, and instead the fault of the manufacturer for this universal level sender. I didn't leave a review on Amazon for it just yet, but I think that I might. So to fix this, I simply reflowed the joint for it, and that's just a matter of getting the soldering iron nice and hot and pressing it against the metal. And now it's actually showing a full connection between the wire and the metal arm. So this should be fixed. But honestly though, I didn't trust that joint to not fail again, so I soldered another wire to a different spot on the arm and soldered the end of that to the middle of the original ground wire. That might be a little overkill, but I also don't want to drop this tank ever again. Although the slop in the system isn't a problem, I still wanted to reduce it a little bit. It's due to the gap between the pivot arm and the housing. So I got a washer that's a little more than double the thickness of the original one I had in here, and that helped a whole lot.
Oh, there's significantly less wobble.
Originally, I used this chunker of a bracket that the universal sender came with for fastening the potentiometer down, but that's just a whole lot of weight for my little bracket I made. Not that my solder joint can't handle it, but it's just unnecessary. So I replaced that with nylon lock nuts. And nylon is super fuel resistant, so that's not going to be a problem. One last check to make sure everything still works.
Alright.
Then it's back in the tank. And back in the car. That right there is a wonderful sight. But would you look at that? The tach is stuck at 4,000 RPM. That's not right. On the very first test drive I ever took this car on, I mentioned that the tach was stuck. Well, that's not true. It works at and above 4,000 RPM, as you can see when I rev the engine. Because of the fact that the signal for it is based on the ignition pickup that the ECU uses, and the car runs perfectly fine, the issue is probably with the instrument cluster. I also know that it can't really be a mechanical problem. It's not actually stuck. The needle's position is controlled entirely by magnetism, no gears or anything like that. So the coils that control the magnetic field just aren't working as they should, and that could be a problem with the coils themselves or the circuitry controlling the coils.
Whoa! I was not expecting that.
I whipped out my multimeter yet again and checked the resistance for each of the coils through their common point, each at around 200 ohms and 400 ohms when read together, which is exactly what it should be. So that means the physical gauge itself is perfect like I thought, but also so are all of the traces and solder joints for the circuit board. I tested every single one of them. The diodes also checked out, and I didn't see any loose electrons leaking from the capacitors. So it's looking like the issue is with the ICs, the microchips. I searched the chip numbers online and found absolutely nothing about them. But what I did find is a brand new aftermarket replacement board on eBay for not too much money. The circuitry is a little different since this new one only has one IC instead of the two the factory one came with, but it's supposed to do the exact same thing and be a direct replacement.
Is it Imperial? Oh my gosh. It's probably 1/4 inch. It's 1/4 inch. Alright.
GM, I know you were trying to indicate stainless steel, but maybe you could have chosen a better font than this. Jesus Christ.
When I turn the key, it should go down to 0. Oh, that tack is at 0.
That is every instrument in the instrument cluster working exactly as it should. But there's always a but. There's one last little thing in the interior that isn't exactly working as it should. Well, at least part of it is in here. Is it the radio? Well, yes, but also no. I did say in the video I made on fixing the radio that this was filmed after the work done in this video, so technically yes, it does need to be fixed still at this point in time, but what I'm talking about here is the wiper system, namely the phantom wipe.
Thank you.
When I rebuilt the wiper linkage back in part 9, I showed you guys it working properly, mechanically properly. What I didn't show you was the system coming on automatically as soon as I put the key in the on position. The wipers also went on automatically in part 7 when going on a test drive too. And neither of those were supposed to happen. I haven't dealt with this issue recently because 1, the wipers aren't installed right now, and 2, I pulled the fuse so I wouldn't have to hear the motor whirring every single time I turned the car on. Fieros, and a lot of GM vehicles for that matter, are notorious for having this issue. It can be caused by a multitude of problems, but often is the result of a bad wiper delay board which directly controls the motor and its intermittent functionality. But when going to take the cover off for this control board, I noticed that the screw wasn't secured all the way. Someone's been in here before.
That's a circuit board.
And more than that, this is not a factory board. A bit of Googling will show you that the factory board has a big fat Delco logo right in the corner, so that's kind of a red flag. Not the replacement board itself, but the fact that a board was replaced, more than likely in an attempt to fix the phantom wipe, and the problem still persists. So if the control board isn't the issue, all my research pointed to the problem being the actual switch in the steering column. I was preparing myself mentally to go through the dread of pulling apart the column again just to access the little switch and address whatever was wrong, but I found a thread online where someone swore by fixing the issue simply by cycling through the different positions on the switch for a few minutes. Apparently it just cleans up any corrosion on the contacts of the switch, at least enough for it to function. So I did just that, got some new fuses, installed one of those, and then put everything back together and back on the car.
I'm going to turn the key.
Well, hey, hold on. There might be a reason for that, actually. The motor was here, but now it's here. I think I turned the motor off before it stopped by itself automatically, so because the circuit breaker was open, it wanted to keep going until it reset itself. Let's try this one more time. Nothing happened. That's good! That's great! And also, everything still works when I use the switch. That is absolutely amazing, and also a little bit frustrating that the problem was really that simple to fix, and nothing else at all had to be done.
No, I'm just kidding. That seriously was all it took. But there is one more thing for the wiper system that I gotta take care of.
While not part of the wipers directly, it is part of the same wiper system. And that is that the washer fluid pump is not working. I hear a click when I go to activate it, but not much more than that. Keep in mind that this is a very cheap motor, 36 years old, and lived a life in a liquid environment. It has a decent amount of rust on the outside, and there's probably a lot more on the inside too. To see if there's any chance in reviving this thing, I got out the vintage battery charger and hooked up the power directly to the terminals. And nothing happened at all. I thought the motor was just seized, and then all of a sudden...
I'm gonna go out on a limb and say you're probably not supposed to send that many amps through a motor this small, as well as the fact that you're probably not supposed to run it without liquid going through it, because that also probably is what cools it down. It's pretty warm, and it smells pretty toasty. Because if it took 6 amps to free that up, No wonder that whatever the lower amps were for it wasn't making it spin at all. So I'm gonna turn the washer switch and we're gonna see what happens.
It started to work, although horribly. But that's okay, I was just trying to make sure that there wasn't an electrical gremlin somewhere else in the system. The issue was probably just a bad motor. So I snagged a new one up for the high price of $10.
Nice, that is a good working pump.
So even though this is working, I'm still a little bit curious to see how bad the original one was. Oh yeah, that boy is crusty. Alright, with the washer pump now good and working, it's time to do a few more small jobs up here in the front. The first thing to do is tackle a potential problem. Every single hose was replaced for the car, except for 2 hoses for the radiator. Not only are these hoses factory original, but also the very rusty hose clamps. I'd rather not risk a failure of these, so they're going to be replaced with brand new ones. If you want to see the full video of this draining, I'll have it linked down below. This is one of those things where it's just so cheap to do, it can only be beneficial. And also, it only took like 20 minutes, so there's no excuse.
Get the heck out of here. Oh, you telling me I wasn't even recording that? Oh my gosh. Well, I put that on there.
Besides that potential problem with the hoses, there is an outright problem, and that's with the coolant overflow tank. It's cracked, and one of the 2 mounting tabs completely broke off. This thing is broken. But not for long. Before jumping right into fixing, I gotta clean this sludge up.
Shazam!
Super glue is used to get everything in place temporarily, but to really secure it, I'm gonna do a bit of experimentation. There are products out there that allow you to do what's called plastic stapling. Hell, Eastwood, who has helped me out with some tools for this project in the past, even makes and sells a plastic stapler, but I wanted to do a true DIY method. I also didn't want to wait for stuff to come in, but all you should need is just some wire and a blowtorch. Basically, the goal is to embed the metal into the plastic so it can act as a skeleton, and since this piece was pretty much split all over, I plastic stapled all over. I'm sure the proper tool for the job, the handle of the gun, really makes it easy to press this in, but for my method I had to use a screwdriver as an extra tool to really get it in there. There's really nothing to it besides just some patience. It's ugly though, not gonna lie. Even after grinding the protruding wire ends down, it still looks like a creation from Dr. Frankenstein. I also want to do a little bit more than just the metal embedded, and I still need to fix the crack next to this. 2 birds meet stone. I drilled out both ends of the crack to remove the stress concentrations, beveled it out to have maximum surface area for adhesion, sanded the entire surface of both these problem areas for good mechanical bonding, and cleaned it off with degreaser. I did also use adhesion promoter here. I'm sure it's not completely necessary, but I've heard that adding it on before epoxy really does help. For the mounting tab, I also added a little bit of fiberglass drywall repair tape, just to really add some strength back into the part. After some cure time, and some sanding, we have this. A completely invisible repair. From the front. The back is still a little bumpy, and the glob of epoxy over the crack is a little unsightly, but then again, so was the crack itself. But all in all, this is a good, strong mechanical repair. If you're worried about the crack not holding and coolant leaking out, stop. Like I said, this is an overflow tank. It's never pressurized, and the lid already has a hole in it for coolant to leak out of if it overflows too much, meaning the crack technically didn't have to be repaired since it would just be another avenue for the coolant to leak out of in a worst case scenario, but still, I repaired it, and I'm glad. And speaking of worst case scenarios, these little jobs for the cooling system I just did help mitigate the possibility of failure. Failure where the worst case scenario is that the car starts to overheat, I pull over when I notice, and I call AAA and get towed back home. The worst case scenario for another system on this car is a little bit more lethal. The brakes were the very first thing I rebuilt on this car. And when I say brakes, of course I mean just the brake calipers. I've been getting away with using the original master cylinder with 36-year-old seals. Now, they have been working perfectly, but truthfully, I've only driven this car less than 100 miles since getting it running. It's pretty much lived most of its life in my ownership in this barn. There is no telling how these seals will hold up long term, and it doesn't make sense to find out, especially when rebuilding this thing only takes about half an hour. 15 of those 30 minutes were struggling with removing the reservoir until I realized that it actually doesn't have to come off in order to replace the seals that allow this thing to operate.
So I'm just not going to take that off.
I compressed the plunger down with a big old clamp and spent 5 minutes trying to get the retainer clip out.
Oh, yeah. Oh, goodness gracious.
The whole inside bore was given a good spray with an aerosolized solvent and a thorough wipe down. I probably should be doing this on a piece of cardboard, huh? The seals on the new plungers for the rebuild kit were lubed up, and then they were slid in place. And once that was squeezed down, and the new retainer clip popped in, that's it. That's the brake master cylinder completely rebuilt, as well as the very last sealed mechanical component on this car overhauled. Anything that could possibly leak or even fail on this car is now probably not going to. The last thing to do was fully bleed the brakes, and now this job is done. You know, with the wheels off the car already, I should probably do something about them. There's still trailer tires on these. And I said all the way back in part 1 of this series that they are just going to be a temporary solution. So now is when that temporary status stops. Before I slap on new tires though, I want to clean these wheels up a little bit. I've only washed them one time, and that was back in April of 2018, close to 3 years ago. I think they're due for a bit of a cleanup. They should look a little more like this right here. Keeping with the theme of being way better than before, but maybe not quite perfect, these wheels are just going to be given a thorough cleaning. And I know that a lot of you guys wanted me to get different wheels, but I really like these 13-inch turbo fin factory optioned ones. Of the wheel options for the Fiero that weren't the cheap stamped steel ones, these are the rarest. Now, rare does absolutely not mean desirable, I know that, but I really do think they're neat, so they're staying. However, since they are teeny tiny 13-inch rims that are meant to have an outer diameter as large as the bigger option wheels with their tires, it was a bit tricky finding the right ones for this. In all my searching, I could only find one tire from one manufacturer that was the correct 185/80 R13 size, and that's also meant to be a passenger tire, not a trailer tire. There were so many trailer tire options, so many, but the only choice I had was from a company called Maxxis. It's a Taiwanese company, but to my luck, they have a warehouse in Dallas, so shipping to Houston was only like 2 days. Not bad at all. And as you may have noticed, these are indeed blue wall tires. Oh wait, these are indeed white wall tires. And as fun as it might be to sport that look, and believe me, I really did entertain the idea, I decided to have the white walls on the inside. I am going to do something a little reminiscent of the past for these tires, but maybe not this far back. but I'll show you that later. Before throwing these wheels on the car all willy-nilly, I need to do some housekeeping first. Whenever I bolted up the rear suspension originally, I made the mistake of torquing down the control arm bushings with the suspension at full droop, instead of where the control arms sit when the car is resting on the ground. So I'm gonna loosen them up, push the suspension up, and then torque everything down where it's supposed to be. The last thing I want to do before fitting the wheels back here is take care of the liners. The rear has 2 parts for each wheel well, and these lower ones are, or were, the engine bay barriers. The driver's side one is pretty torn up, and the passenger side one is pretty much non-existent. I was going to do a DIY version of these, but the price for the raw materials for me to do it myself is not a lot less than the price for brand new ones already made.
There's dirt in my eye. I just Peter Parkered myself.
Not to mention that I also don't have a template to go off of for one side. So, new ones were purchased. I probably could have gotten away with not worrying about these at all. I know a lot of people don't when they rebuild Fieros, because they technically aren't necessary for the vehicle to operate, but they were here for a reason. Rocks, road debris, a child's hopes and dreams that fell out of the window on a family road trip, or anything else that my tire could fling up might just fling up inside the engine bay if these weren't here. That's not ideal in the best case scenario, and definitely not if it were to happen on the passenger side where all the engine's pulleys and belts are. So for me, I definitely want these here. Now I can finally install the plastic liners back in and wrap up this rear end. Unfortunately, the front of the car can't be wrapped up not yet. Whoa, why is there mud all over the tires now? That's weird. But the front of the car can't be wrapped up just yet. I posted this photo on Instagram a couple of months back, that's at Fingerprints Workshop, and Milo made me a little self-conscious with a jab about how the Fiero is sitting, only to realize that Milo's jab was actually just Milo's observation. The Fiero is sitting lower in the back than it is in the front. This pinch weld right here is supposed to be perfectly parallel with the ground. I got a tape measure out and butted it up right to the seam here in the back and locked it in place. I moved it to the front, and there's just so much wiggle room. Disgusting. Now, granted, the front body panels aren't on the car, but the weight of those should not have that much of an effect on this. Analyzing this atrocity at the tires directly is going to give us a better idea of how off it actually is. What I'm looking at is just the difference for the two, so it doesn't really matter where I measure from, just as long as it's the same for both spots. For the rear, this measurement is a hair over 130 millimeters, and for the front, it's just a hair under 160 millimeters. That's a difference of just over 30 millimeters. That is a pretty big difference, but there is an easy solution to this. Eibach, one of the big suspension component manufacturers, happens to only carry lowering springs for the Fiero.
Oh, wow.
It is sold as a complete kit, unfortunately, so I might just sell the rear ones to get some money back. But either way, these front springs are going on, and hopefully they're going to bring the car down to a reasonable ride height. There's already an entire video I made dedicated to the process of taking apart and restoring the front suspension, which I'm sure all of you have seen. Yep, identical view counts. But the basic process is to remove the caliper, remove the cotter pin and nut for the tie rod, pop the tie rod out, unbolt the shock absorber, then separate the knuckle. Originally I tried taking off the top ball joint, but I couldn't get the separator tool in there without tearing up the rubber boot, so I ended up just only removing the lower one and raising the top control arm out of the way and tightening it back down. Now if you're restoring everything like I previously did, obviously it'll all have to come apart, and dealing with a torn boot then is super easy, barely an inconvenience. But because I'm only trying to get this spring out, I'd much rather take it being a minor inconvenience than me having to deal with a torn boot.
Finally, jeez Louise.
Now clearly the new one is shorter, definitely more than the 30 millimeters of drop we need. However, the new one has a much higher spring rate than the factory one, which means it's a lot stiffer. When on the car and compressed by the weight of the vehicle, it's only going to be a little bit shorter than the factory one, not anywhere near this current difference, which is exactly what we want. There is one slight issue though. The ends of the springs don't fall in the same position rotationally. That's an issue because the bottom of the spring perch makes it so the spring is clocked in a very specific position. And because the spring is inserted into the top perch first, the little rubber hat that goes up top, which also only fits on in one position, has an alignment mark that corresponds to a notch in the perch to make sure that the lower alignment happens. Make sense? No? With the coil of the new one ending in a different position, the bottom of the spring wouldn't line up at all if the top of the spring is inserted how the alignment mark currently is. So the solution? Just cut the little nub off, you ding-dong. The only thing you gotta be careful of is really making sure that the spring is gonna be clocked in the correct position on the lower perch. Using the precision instrument that is my eyeball, I set up the spring in the lower perch and found where the new spot on the rubber hat is that lines up with the notch on the frame. Thin masking tape makes a pretty good indexer for that. The only thing left to do now is compress everything and then pull it back in with the wire. Even though this spring is shorter than the factory one, it still has to have that slight banana shape in order to fit over the hump in the lower perch. Please know that just because I had success with this wire trick previously on this car and on my buddy's Blazer, it doesn't make it any less sketchy. With this now in place, I can unpucker my butthole and reinstall everything as it was before. Oh, and also don't forget there's one other side to do too. Okay, let's see how this thing sits now. iBox sold this as a 0.8 inch drop.
So that's at 110, so it's lower in the front. That was more than a 0.8 inch drop. I'm okay with that. I'm very okay with that.
Having the car a little bit lower in the front gives it more of that hot rod look, even though this car is anything but that. It's very slight, but I can dig it. I especially like that the wheel actually seems to be concentric with the curve of the fender. That's a lot better than the rock crawler look it was sporting before. These lowering springs, though, definitely messed with the alignment of the car. Before I start spinning tie rods around, though, to fix the alignment, I want to address something regarding the alignment that can be made better. There's a slight range of motion for the steering wheel where turning it doesn't turn the wheels. Now, it's not the same issue I had before when the whole column was wobbly, but this is due to a lack of preload on the actual rack component of the steering rack. A little bit of looseness is not a problem, but this can be adjusted to be a little bit more tight. There's a big locking nut on the outside that secures down a threaded plug that does the actual adjusting of the tension. There's a spring inside that the plug presses against, and that spring presses against another little piece that pushes the rack against the pinion. And after absolutely failing to get either of those loose, I decided to completely forget about this. I'm just not going to worry about it. It's not even a problem. It's just scope creep. It's not an issue. I'm just finding things.
Why would you even record that narration? Why would you do that? Why would you do that?
These lowering springs definitely messed with the alignment of the car though. I'm going to start spinning some tie rods and get this thing a little bit more aligned. Using the tape measure method I learned from Fuzzy Dice Projects, I got these wheels looking a little less side-goggling. Basically, the process is just to measure the tread at about the same height on the front and back of the tires, making sure that both of those measurements are close to the same. I'm sure it's different for every vehicle, but the Fiero is spec'd out to have a little bit of toe in, meaning the wheels should be pointing towards each other a little bit in the front. Not to the point where you would confuse this car with Tommy Pickles, but a little less than a combined angle of a degree is perfectly fine. So with that taken care of, there's one last thing I can do here to wrap things up. I'm going to go ahead and cap off these wheels with the wheel well liners. And yes, thank you for noticing, this is indeed the new Fingerprints Workshop long sleeve shirt, with Fingerprints Workshop right on the sleeve, and also a little 85 2M4 on the front to commemorate this project, as well as a fingerprint logo right on the nipple to commemorate forensic investigation and nipples. But cool! I think that's it. All of the little jobs that I get to check off the list are now taken care of. I asked at the end of the previously posted Saturday Projects video, which I mentioned was filmed after doing the work for this video, if anyone could spy any of the work that has been done. As far as I could tell, only one person was able to point out a single thing, and that was that the fender liners were on. I was hoping that there would be at least a few people with eagle eyes able to spot the repaired overflow tank, or maybe even that the car was sitting lower, but I guess that was just wishful thinking. Regardless, like I said, that is every little job completely done. Now, really, the only things left to do is to replace that cracked windshield, install a new rear view mirror, and slap on the rest of the body panels. And the car is done. The entire project, what I've spent the last 3 years doing, is done. So, until next time, I'll see you guys later.